April 9, 1918, 4:47 a.m., Neuve-Chapelle sector, France. The barrage hit like God's fist slamming into the earth. Aníbal Augusto Milhais pressed his face into the mud as the world exploded. Shells screamed overhead, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. The Portuguese trench dissolved into fire and flying dirt. Timbers cracked, sandbags vaporized. Somewhere to his left, a man screamed once and went silent. 4 hours. That's how long headquarters said the German bombardment would last before the real attack came. Milhais counted seconds between impacts. 2 seconds, 1 second, no seconds. The shells were falling so fast they overlapped into one continuous roar. He was 23 years old, and he'd been at war for 11 months. Long enough to know what this meant. This wasn't a raid. This was an execution. The Portuguese 2nd Division held a 9-kilometer stretch of the Western Front, a quiet sector where nothing happened. 10,000 men spread thin across trenches that hadn't seen serious action in months. The High Command thought it was safe, easy duty for inexperienced Portuguese troops fresh off the boats from Lisbon. They were wrong. Milhais gripped his Lewis gun tighter as the world shook. The weapon was heavy, 28 pounds of steel and wood that could fire 500 rounds per minute when it worked, when it didn't jam, when the barrel didn't overheat and warp. When you had ammunition, he had 3 drums, 141 rounds. After that, he'd be swinging the gun like a club. The barrage lifted at exactly 8:45 a.m. The silence felt wrong, unnatural. Milhais's ears rang so badly he couldn't hear his own breathing. Dust hung in the air, thick as smoke. The trench, what remained of it, looked like the moon. Craters overlapping craters, bodies buried under collapsed walls, a severed hand still gripping a rifle. "Stand to! Stand to!" Sergeant Costa's voice cut through the ringing. The man appeared through the smoke, blood running down the side of his face. "They're coming! Get on the firing step!" Milhais didn't need to be told. He was already mounting his Lewis gun on the parapet, hands working on pure muscle memory. Load the drum, check the feed, pull the bolt, point down range. He looked across no man's land and his stomach dropped. They weren't coming. They were already here. Gray figures materialized from the morning mist like ghosts, hundreds of them, thousands. German stormtroopers in their coal scuttle helmets, moving in disciplined waves across the churned earth. Some carried rifles, others had flamethrowers. Behind them came more troops, and behind those, more still. "Meu Deus," someone whispered beside Milhais. My God, the Portuguese rifles opened up, scattered, disorganized firing. Bullets whipped across no man's land, but the Germans kept coming. They'd trained for this, rehearsed it. This was their Kaiserschlacht, their spring offensive, the final push to win the war before the Americans arrived in force, and they'd chosen the Portuguese sector to break through. Milhais squeezed the trigger. The Lewis gun roared, brass casings ejected in a golden stream. The first burst caught 3 Germans mid-stride, spinning them sideways. He shifted aim, fired again. Another burst, another group of gray uniforms dropping. The gun kicked against his shoulder like a living thing, but for every German who fell, 10 more appeared. To his right, a Portuguese machine gun nest exploded in a gout of flame. Flamethrower. To his left, men were already abandoning the trench, running, not retreating, running. Panic had them. "Hold the line," Sergeant Costa bellowed, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Another explosion. Costa disappeared in a cloud of red mist. The Lewis gun clicked empty. Milhais dropped the spent drum, fumbled for a fresh one. His hands shook, not from fear but from adrenaline. 22 seconds to change drums if you were fast. He did it in 15. The Germans were 50 meters away now, close enough to see their faces, young faces, old faces, scared faces, eager faces, men who wanted to live just as badly as he did. The Lewis gun spoke again. A German officer with a pistol went down, a machine gunner, a medic with a red cross on his arm. Milhais didn't care, couldn't care. Everyone was a target, everyone was the enemy. Something whistled overhead and the trench behind him erupted. The concussion threw Milhais forward into the parapet. His ears popped. Blood ran hot from his nose. When he looked back, the communication trench, the one that led to the rear positions, was gone. Just a crater now, filled with body parts and broken equipment. They were cut off. Fall back to the second line." Milhais didn't see who gave the order. maybe nobody, maybe everyone. But suddenly the Portuguese were climbing out of the trench and running, streaming back across open ground toward positions that probably didn't exist anymore. He looked at his Lewis gun, looked at the Germans, now 30 meters away and closing, looked at his comrades disappearing into the smoke, and Milhais made a choice. He wasn't running. Someone had to slow them down. Someone had to buy time for the others to regroup, to establish a new line, to maybe stop this breakthrough from turning into a total collapse. That someone was him. Milhais shifted the Lewis gun to face the main German advance. One drum left, 47 rounds. Not enough to stop an army, barely enough to annoy one, but it would have to do. The last Portuguese soldier disappeared over the ridge behind him. Milhais was alone now, one man, one gun, and an entire German division bearing down on his position. He pulled the trigger and kept pulling. 9:12 a.m., Ferme du Bois sector, 47 rounds left. Milhais watched the Germans regroup 200 meters downslope. They'd pulled back after his last burst cut down their lead squad, but they weren't retreating, just regrouping, calling up reinforcements, bringing forward machine guns of their own. Behind him, silence. The Portuguese lines were empty now except for the dead, bodies slumped in firing positions, still gripping rifles they'd never reload. A corporal draped over the parapet with half his head missing. 3 men in a heap where a shell had caught them trying to run. Milhais was in a good position at least. The Germans had to come uphill to get him. The shelter, a reinforced dugout that had somehow survived the barrage, gave him cover and a clear field of fire down the slope toward La Couture village. Anyone coming up that hill would be exposed for 200 meters. But there were so many of them. 2 full German divisions, the 42nd Infantry Division and the 8th Bavarian Reserve. Maybe 100,000 men total in the offensive, and God knows how many were pointed at this exact spot. The Portuguese 2nd Division, his division, had fielded 20,000 men this morning. Most of them were dead, wounded, or running now. The math was simple. The math was terrifying. He checked his Lewis gun. The barrel was hot, but not dangerously so. The mechanism seemed fine. No jams yet, which was a minor miracle. The gun had a reputation for jamming at the worst possible moments. Feed it too fast and the spring-loaded drum would fail. Fire too long and the barrel would warp. Get dirt in the action and you had a 28-pound club. But right now, it was the only thing keeping him alive. Movement below. The Germans were coming again. This time they were smarter. Instead of a dense formation, they spread out, skirmish lines with 5 meters between each man. Harder targets. And they were using fire and movement tactics, with one group providing covering fire while another advanced. Professional soldiers, stormtroopers, the Kaiserschlacht elite. Milhais let them get closer, waiting until they were 100 meters out and fully committed to the slope. The moment the lead elements hit the bare ground halfway up the hill, he opened fire. The Lewis gun hammered, 3-round bursts, shift aim, 3 more rounds, shift again. The German line rippled as men went down. Someone screamed in German. Return fire cracked overhead, but Milhais kept his head down, firing through gaps in the dugout's reinforced walls. Empty. Last drum. 47 rounds. He'd counted every single one. The Germans pulled back again, dragging their wounded. Milhais counted at least 12 bodies they'd left behind. 12 dead Germans. 12 men who'd woken up this morning thinking they'd break through and win the war by summer. Now they were meat for the French soil. Milhais' hands shook as he loaded the final drum. Not fear. He was past fear now. This was something else. Acceptance, maybe. He'd die here. That was certain. The only question was how many he'd take with him. A whistle blew downslope, then another, then a dozen. This time they came from 3 directions at once. The main body charged straight up the hill, maybe 40 men. Another group swung wide left using a drainage ditch for cover. A third group moved right toward the ruins of a farmhouse. Classic envelopment. They were going to surround him, suppress him with crossfire, then rush the position. Milhais chose the center group, the ones coming straight at him. He couldn't stop all 3, but he could kill enough of them to slow the advance. Buy more time for the Portuguese and Scots who were even now trying to form a new defensive line somewhere behind him. The Lewis gun roared. The lead German fell. Then another. The third man dove behind a shell crater. Milhais stitched the crater's edge with bullets, and the man didn't move again. He swung left, caught 2 men in the ditch, swung right, fired at the farmhouse group. 20 rounds left. 15, 10. A German machine gun opened up from downslope. Bullets ripped through the dugout's timber frame. Splinters exploded. Milhais felt something hot slash across his left forearm, but ignored it. 5 rounds. 3, 1. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. Silence. Just for a second. The Germans had gone to ground, waiting for their machine gun to suppress him so they could advance. Smart. Professional. Milhais looked at his Lewis gun, then at the trenches behind him where dead Portuguese soldiers lay, soldiers who didn't need their ammunition anymore. "Disculpe, meus amigos," he whispered. "Sorry, my friends." He climbed out of the dugout and ran. Bullets whip-cracked past his head. The German machine gun tracked him, tearing up the ground at his feet. Milhais sprinted through the trench, jumping over bodies, sliding through mud. There, a dead soldier slumped in a firing bay with a Lewis gun beside him and 3 full drums stacked neatly against the trench wall. Milhais grabbed 2 drums and ran back. A bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another ricocheted off his helmet with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. His ears rang, but he kept moving, kept running, reached the dugout and threw himself inside. Fresh drum loaded, bolt pulled, rounds in the chamber. The Germans were 50 meters away now and closing fast. Milhais fired. The leftmost man jerked and fell. The next burst caught 3 stormtroopers in a group. They went down thrashing. He swung the gun right, found targets, fired. The Lewis gun was screaming now, barrel smoking. The mechanism was starting to resist, too hot, too fast. He could feel it wanting to jam. Not yet, just a little longer. A German appeared at the dugout entrance. How had he gotten so close? With a stick grenade raised. Milhais spun the Lewis gun and fired point blank. The German disintegrated. The grenade fell, bounced once. Milhais kicked it outside. It detonated 3 seconds later, the blast wave hammering his lungs. When his vision cleared, the Germans were pulling back again. 3rd time. But this time they were moving more slowly, more carefully. They'd learned respect. 1 man with a machine gun had stopped 2 regimental assaults. They'd need artillery now, or flamethrowers, or they'd just go around him. Milhais ejected the spent drum. 1 full drum left. Then he'd have to make another run for ammunition, then another, until eventually a bullet found him, or a shell landed in the dugout, or he simply ran out of dead Portuguese soldiers to rob. He checked his watch. 10:37 a.m. He'd been fighting alone for almost 90 minutes. How much time did the others need? How long until the new line was established? An hour? 2 hours? All day? It didn't matter. He'd hold as long as he could. Below, the Germans were bringing up a flamethrower team. Milhais watched them come and loaded his last drum. As the sun disappeared behind the shattered horizon, Aníbal Milhais found himself alone amidst the ruins of what had once been the Portuguese front line. His body was battered, his forearm burned from shrapnel wounds, his lungs ached from the choking dust, and his hands trembled with exhaustion. But worse than the pain was the crushing weight of isolation. The deafening artillery barrage had ceased, leaving only the distant rumble of gunfire and the ominous silence of a battlefield claimed by enemy forces. The Portuguese troops had fallen back or been cut down. The trenches were littered with the bodies of comrades. For miles, the once proud 2nd Division was now just a graveyard of mud, blood, and broken dreams. Milhais took refuge in a battered dugout, deep within a collapsed trench segment, its walls crumbling but still offering some protection. He took a shallow sip from a muddy puddle, the bitter water barely enough to wet his cracked lips. Hunger gnawed mercilessly, and fatigue pressed on him like an iron weight, but he refused to surrender to weakness. Time blurred. Minutes stretched into hours under the oppressive night sky. Sounds echoed. Distant footsteps, the snapping of twigs, low murmurs, reminders that German patrols scoured the battlefield, searching for survivors to capture or kill. Milhais's grip tightened on his Lewis gun as his eyes scanned the shifting shadows for the slightest hint of movement. In the solitude, his thoughts drifted from the horrors around him to a faraway home. Sun-dappled pine forests of Portugal, the warm embrace of his mother, fields of wheat swaying in the breeze. These memories were fragile threads, anchoring his spirit against the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, a noise broke the heavy silence, a soft rustle, a cautious step near the edge of his position. Heart pounding, Milhais aimed his gun toward the source. Emerging from the shadows was another Portuguese soldier, bloodied and weary, lost in the chaos of retreat. Relief flooded his body. He was not the last. Together they shared their dwindling supplies, scarce ammunition, stale hardtack, and drops of water, whispering stories to stave off despair and planning their next move. The night wore on with agony, each second a test of endurance and resolve. As dawn's first light painted the broken landscape in pale gray, Milhais steeled himself for what lay ahead. Reinforcements from the German army would return soon, bringing flamethrowers and artillery to purge the land. The hours to prepare were few, but Milhais was determined. His fight was far from over. His gun was ready, his will unyielding, and his resolve as fierce as ever. He would hold the line, no matter the cost. Morning broke cold and gray over the shattered battlefield. The distant rumble of artillery began anew. The Germans were bringing heavier weapons forward. Aníbal Milhais knew this meant one thing: the assault wasn't over. It was only just beginning. His ammunition was dangerously low, only 2 full drums left for his Lewis gun. But the gun felt like an extension of his own arms now, a loyal companion in the inferno. Around him, the trench was littered with spent shells and the bodies of fallen comrades, grim reminders of the price already paid. Suddenly, movement surfaced through the fog, German infantry advancing again, this time with flamethrowers and engineers marking the path. The lead squad sprinted across the open ground, fearless in their mission to flush him out. Milhais took a deep breath, steadying his hands. The gun crackled to life, hailing a furious storm of lead. Men fell like wheat before the scythe, but more pressed forward without hesitation. Flamethrowers burst into flame, sending waves of fire licking the earth near his position. Smoke and heat mingled with the acrid scent of gunpowder and burnt flesh. The trench shook under another nearby explosion. Milhais felt a searing pain hit his leg, but refused to falter, continuing to lay down suppressive fire. Each round was a lifeline for the retreating Portuguese units regrouping behind him. A German officer appeared at the trench's edge, signaling the final charge. Milhais spotted the man, took aim, and squeezed the trigger. The officer staggered and collapsed, the command lost. With his position compromised and ammunition nearly empty, Milhais prepared to fight hand-to-hand if necessary. He grabbed his sidearm, a pistol, and waited as the enemy closed in. As the first soldiers broke into the trench, he fired the last rounds in his drum. Then, wielding the Lewis gun's heavy stock, he engaged in brutal close combat. Punches, kicks, and rifle butts exchanged in the claustrophobic mud. Surrounded and exhausted, he was finally overwhelmed, captured, but unbroken. His defiance had delayed the German advance long enough for Allied forces to stabilize the front and regroup. Milhais's single-handed stand became a symbol of courage, one man against an army, a testament to human will against impossible odds. After being captured during his final stand, Aníbal Milhais was thrust into a harsh and unforgiving world far from the battlefield's cacophony. His body ached from wounds sustained in battle, his spirit threatened by the relentless grind of captivity. Imprisoned in a network of German POW camps, Milhais faced the grim realities of war and confinement. The camps were bleak and overcrowded, with inadequate food and poor sanitation. Despair clung to the air like a thick fog, and many prisoners succumbed to illness or hopelessness. Yet Milhais found ways to endure. His keen mind observed the routines of guards and the layout of the camp, searching for weakness and opportunity. He made allies among fellow prisoners, forming bonds that kindled hope amid desolation. His wounds healed slowly, each ache a reminder of his defiance on the battlefield. Memories of Portugal, its rolling hills, the scent of pine forests, the face of his mother, spurred him forward, strengthening his resolve to escape. One night, Milhais noticed a shift in the camp's vigilance. Guard rotations left a fleeting window where security was lax. He and a small group of prisoners began covertly planning their escape, sharing stolen scraps of information and crafting a desperate plan. The chosen night was a tempest of fear and adrenaline. Under the cloak of darkness, they slipped silently through barbed wire gaps and lupin shadows. Alarms blared suddenly, shouts tore through the night, and gunfire splintered the silence, but the group pressed on. Milhais ran with a fierce urgency, Every step a battle against exhaustion, pain, and the unforgiving terrain ahead. Ahead lay the forests that could be sanctuary or death trap, their darkness both shield and threat. For days, he navigated the hostile landscape, evading patrols, scavenging to survive, and guided by stars and an unyielding will to return home. Every rustle in the leaves, every distant bark, was a reminder of danger. Yet hope burned brighter than fear. His journey beyond enemy lines was a test of willpower, courage, and sheer human grit. Milhais's legend grew not just from his battlefield valor, but from his desperate flight to freedom against overwhelming odds. The landscape transformed into a nightmare of mud, water, and endless reeds that whispered secrets in the cold wind. The swamp was a cruel and merciless enemy, silent but deadly, swallowing entire men in its depths without a sound. For Aníbal Milhais, every step was a perilous gamble, sinking waist-deep into the cold, murky water, struggling to pull himself free with trembling arms scarred by thorns and soaked to the bone. The cold gnawed at his bones relentlessly. Each breath felt like freezing fire, and his aching muscles screamed against the unforgiving terrain. His leg wound throbbed with every movement, sending sharp jolts of pain that threatened to unbalance his fragile grip on survival. Hunger clawed at his insides. Dried berries and muddy puddle sips were all that kept him from collapse. Yet, despite the physical torment, his mind stayed sharp, every sense heightened by the desperate need to stay alive. Amid the oppression of the marshlands, human connection brought unexpected light. Milhais encountered a Scottish major, also battered by war and brutal terrain, whose resilience matched his own. Though strangers and on opposite sides of the conflict, their shared struggle forged an unspoken pact of brotherhood. Together, they navigated the quagmire, lending strength where the other faltered, whispering hopes for home and liberation in the long, dark hours. The swamp was everywhere, every step met with sucking mud, every breath laden with the scent of decay and wet earth. At night, the cold seeped deeper, chilling them past teeth chatter, making every touch and movement agony. It was a land without mercy, where a single misstep could mean sinking forever into the darkness below. Enemy patrols were not far behind, their footsteps echoing faintly across the waterlogged plains like the thunder of unseen hunters. Every crack of a twig sent pulses racing through their bodies as they pressed onward, evading capture, clinging to survival with every ounce of willpower. The marshland was a crucible of pain and perseverance, but also hope. Under the weight of exhaustion and fear, Milhais and his companion dared to dream of escape, of returning to the land and lives they'd left far behind the endless swamp. Each moment survived was a victory, each sunrise a promise that life, even against the harshest odds, could endure. The swamp that had tested Milhais and the Scottish major was just the beginning of a long, perilous journey back to safety. Every step through the muddy, waterlogged terrain was an epic struggle, a fight not only against exhaustion and injury, but against the unforgiving landscape itself. The air hung heavy with moisture and the scent of decay. Branches and reeds clutched at their clothes. The water was ice cold, sapping strength and chilling them to the bone. Each day was a battle simply to stay upright, to keep moving forward. Their injuries throbbed constantly. Milhais's leg hurt with every step, his hands were raw, and back was tight from the relentless march. Food was scarce, and water was often contaminated, forcing them to drink from puddles and trickles, risking disease. Yet, hunger and thirst could not quiet the hope that burned in Milhais's heart, the burning desire to walk free on solid ground, to hear the familiar sounds of home. They moved cautiously, aware that German patrols scour the forests and fields. Silence was their shield, and shadows their allies. Every crack of a twig sent pulses racing. They avoided roads and clearings, navigating by stars, distant landmarks, and instinct. At night, they sought refuge under dense canopy, whispered words, sharing stories of loved ones waiting beyond the war. These moments of shared humanity kept despair at bay, fueling the courage to face each cold, merciless dawn. Milhais, despite his exhaustion and wounds, found strength in the steely resolve that had defined him on the battlefield, unyielding, relentless, driven by the primal instinct to survive and return home. After weeks of struggle through relentless enemy territory and treacherous terrain, Aníbal Milhais finally crossed back into Allied lines. Exhausted and battered, his arrival was met with disbelief and awe. The soldier who had stood alone against an entire German division, who survived captivity, a daring escape, and a grueling journey through swamps and forests, was back among his compatriots. His wounds, though still painful, bore silent testimony to the heroics that had saved thousands of lives. But Milhais was not content to rest. Like a man possessed by duty and courage, he returned to the front lines, ready to pick up his Lewis gun and continue the fight. The tale of the soldier worth a million spread quickly through the ranks, an emblem of courage, tenacity, and unyielding spirit. Soldiers whispered the story in trenches, officers cited it in briefings, and a nation found in Milhais a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. Back in battle, Milhais was a force unto himself. During a fierce German assault on Belgian positions, he stood alone in the chaos, delivering steady fire that held back waves of enemy troops. His bravery gave the retreating battalion time to regroup and counterattack. For his extraordinary valor, Milhais was awarded the highest military honors, presented to him on the battlefield before his comrades. Despite fame and accolades, he remained humble, a man shaped by war but defined by his unshakable humanity. His story endures as a powerful reminder of the impact one individual can have in the darkest hours of history. A soldier who stood when others fled, whose resolve held a line that might otherwise have broken, whose courage gave hope to many. Aníbal Augusto Milhais, the soldier worth a million, remains immortalized not just as a hero of Portugal, but as a timeless symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit.